Picture this: a fully grown male silverback gorilla, nearly 200 kilograms of muscle, strong enough to bend steel bars, capable of generating 10 times the grip strength of the average human male. By every physical measure, one of the most formidable animals on the planet. Now picture that same animal sitting quietly in the forest, carefully peeling a piece of fruit. A juvenile climbs onto his back. He doesn't move. A female approaches and leans against him. He lets out a slow, low breath and closes his eyes. No dominance display, no aggression, no performance of power, just stillness. Researchers who spend time with wild gorilla troops consistently report the same experience. An overwhelming sense of calm emanating from the silverback. Not the calm of an animal that doesn't notice you. The calm of an animal that has nothing to prove. And that is exactly what makes gorilla psychology one of the most fascinating and most misunderstood subjects in all of primate science. Because the question isn't why gorillas are powerful. The question is why, with all that power, they so rarely use it. Welcome to Primal Mind. In our previous videos, we explored the sharp political intelligence of chimpanzees, the deception, the alliances, the calculated social maneuvering. Today, we are going somewhere entirely different, to a primate whose psychology challenges almost everything we assume about the relationship between power and behavior. Gorillas are our third closest living relatives after chimpanzees and bonobos. And yet, in terms of temperament, social structure, and psychological profile, they could not be more different from the chimp. Where the chimpanzee mind is restless, competitive, and politically complex, the gorilla mind is something rarer, something that, in the animal kingdom, is almost paradoxical. It is powerful, and it is gentle. At the same time, understanding how and why that combination exists, and what it reveals about intelligence, leadership, and social life, is what this video is about. For most of the 20th century, gorillas were portrayed as terrifying, dangerous, unpredictable. Early explorers described them as savage monsters. Hollywood cemented the image for generations. The word gorilla became synonymous with brute, unthinking force. The science told a completely different story. When primatologist Diane Fossey began her long-term field study of mountain gorillas in Rwanda in 1967, she encountered animals that were initially wary, but fundamentally non-aggressive toward humans who approached slowly, behaved calmly, and respected the social signals of the group. Over time, individual gorillas not only tolerated her presence, they initiated contact, groomed her, played with her, sat beside her in comfortable silence. What Fossey documented over 18 years of observations, not a dangerous animal barely containing its aggression. It was a highly social, emotionally sensitive, deeply family-oriented primate whose default behavioral setting, in the absence of genuine threat, was one of remarkable composure. The myth of the savage gorilla was not based on observation. It was based on fear. And fear, as it turns out, is a very poor lens through which to understand one of the most psychologically rich animals on Earth. To understand gorilla psychology, you have to understand the silverback, the dominant male in a gorilla group, named for the distinctive silver patch of fur that develops across his back at maturity, is not simply the biggest or the strongest individual. He is the psychological anchor of the entire group, the emotional center, the decision maker, the protector, and in many ways, the therapist. Silverbacks arbitrate disputes between group members. They comfort distressed juveniles. They position themselves between the group and potential threats, not to attack, but to assess, to display, and if possible, to de-escalate. Researchers have observed silverbacks placing themselves between frightened females and perceived dangers and simply standing, presenting their size, their stillness, their composure, as a signal that the situation is under control. This is leadership as emotional regulation. The silverback's primary social function is not to dominate, it is to stabilize. And here is what makes this psychologically remarkable. Subordinate males in gorilla groups, called blackbacks, rarely challenge the silverback directly, not primarily because they fear being overpowered, but because in a stable, well-led group, there is simply no social pressure driving them to. Their needs are met. The group is cohesive. The silverback has created an environment where conflict has no fertile ground to grow in. Power used wisely enough eventually becomes unnecessary to display. What surprises researchers most when they first encounter gorillas in the field is not their size. It is their emotional expressiveness. Gorillas form deep, long-lasting social bonds. Mothers and offspring maintain close relationships for years, sometimes for life. Individuals within a group develop clear preferences for certain companions, spending more time in proximity to specific others, initiating play and grooming with preferred partners consistently over time. They grieve. When a group member dies, gorillas have been observed remaining near the body for extended periods, touching it gently, sitting in unusual silence, displaying behavioral changes consistent with what researchers carefully describe as mourning responses. Whether this constitutes grief in the full emotional sense remains scientifically debated, but the behavioral reality is undeniable. They also laugh, not in the human sense, but gorillas produce a distinct vocalization during play that researchers have identified as the evolutionary precursor to human laughter. It emerges in the same contexts, tickling, chasing, social roughhousing, and serves the same social function, signaling that an interaction is safe, playful, and enjoyable. An animal that laughs and mourns is an animal with an emotional interior life. That is not anthropomorphism. That is the conclusion of decades of careful behavioral science. Gorillas are not often discussed in the same breath as chimpanzees when it comes to tool use or problem solving. But their cognitive abilities are far more sophisticated than their reputation suggests. The most famous evidence comes from language research. Coco, a western lowland gorilla studied by psychologist Francine Patterson, beginning in the 1970s, learned to use over 1,000 signs from American Sign Language and demonstrated understanding of approximately 2,000 spoken English words. She used signs to express preferences, describe her emotional states, refer to past events, and even make jokes. Whether this constitutes genuine language in the linguistic sense remains a subject of scientific debate. What is not debated is that Coco and other gorillas in similar studies demonstrated a level of symbolic communication, self-reference, and emotional expression that placed them far beyond what most people assumed possible for a non-human animal. Gorillas also passed the mirror self-recognition test, one of the benchmarks researchers use to assess self-awareness. When presented with their own reflection, gorillas demonstrate behaviors consistent with understanding that the image represents themselves. They use mirrors to examine parts of their bodies they cannot otherwise see. They make faces. They investigate. An animal that recognizes itself in a mirror is an animal with a concept of self. And a concept of self is the foundation of almost everything we consider psychologically complex. Here is the question that the science keeps returning to, and that most documentaries never quite ask directly. Why are gorillas so peaceful? Not passive, not incapable of aggression. Silverbacks will defend their groups with extraordinary intensity when genuinely threatened, but as a default behavioral strategy across stable groups, in the absence of external pressure, gorillas consistently choose social cohesion over competition, composure over conflict, and connection over dominance performance. The evolutionary answer involves their ecology. Gorillas are herbivores living on a diet of leaves, stems, and fruit, resources that are widely distributed and not worth fighting over. Unlike chimpanzees, who compete intensely for high-value food sources, gorillas rarely face the resource pressure that drives chronic social conflict. But the psychological answer goes deeper than food. Gorillas appear to have evolved a social intelligence built around stability rather than competition. The silverback's value to the group is not as a fighter. It is as a regulator, a calm, consistent, emotionally reliable presence that allows the group to function, reproduce, and thrive without the constant social friction that characterizes more competitive primates. In evolutionary terms, peace was not a luxury for gorillas. It was a strategy, and it worked. We have spent 2 videos exploring the sharp, competitive, politically complex side of primate psychology. Today, we encountered something different, and in many ways, more challenging to sit with: Because the gorilla does not reflect the parts of human nature we recognize most easily. It reflects the parts we aspire to. The silverback who leads through composure rather than intimidation. The social group held together by genuine bonds rather than fear. The individual who possesses enormous power, and whose primary use of that power is to protect, stabilize, and care for others. These are not animal behaviors we observe from a comfortable scientific distance. They are behavioral ideals that human cultures across history have tried, with varying success, to build institutions around, and they emerge, fully formed, in an animal with no language, no written law, no philosophical tradition, simply the accumulated wisdom of millions of years of social evolution pointing toward the same conclusion, that in a complex social world, the most sustainable form of power is not the kind that demands constant demonstration. It is the kind that makes the people around you feel safe enough that they never question it. The forests of Rwanda and the Congo Basin are still home to some of the last wild mountain gorillas on Earth. Fewer than 1,000 individuals remaining, each one a repository of a social intelligence that took millions of years to build. When you look into the eyes of a silverback, in footage, in photographs, in the rare and extraordinary experience of field encounter, you are not looking at a primitive version of something. You are looking at a different solution to the same problem that every social species faces. How do you live together? How do you hold a group? How do you use power without destroying the thing you are trying to protect? The gorilla worked it out long before we did. And watching them, you cannot help but wonder if we have fully worked it out yet. Stay curious. Stay primal.